A horrifying experience today. It was an incident that happened when Chris was traveling to the mentioned province to take a university entrance exam. However, all the accommodations around the university were fully booked. He then had to travel a bit further out to find a place to stay, which was located farther from the exam venue. And the decision to go out to find accommodation at that time led him to encounter a terrifying story to the point that he had to run for his life. Before we dive into our scary story, we would like to ask everyone to like and subscribe to support us in continuing to bring you more terrifying tales in the future. The whole story happened around the year 1999. At the time of the incident, Chris was about 18 years old. He had to travel to Mahasarkham province to take an entrance exam for a university. Initially, he had arranged with his friends to go together, but something caused Chris to join the group late. So his friends went ahead without him, leaving Chris to travel alone. In those days, owning a mobile phone meant one's family was truly wealthy, and Chris's family did not belong to that group. In fact, his family seemed to be quite poor. None of his friends had mobile phones either, which meant that communicating with his group of friends was nearly impossible. He only had the university's phone number, along with a map for navigating to the nearby accommodations. At first, Chris thought there would be plenty of accommodations in the area, since it was close to the university, and surely there would be places for students to rent. However, when he arrived in the evening, he found that all the accommodations were fully booked. He decided to walk around to see if he could find any friends who might have secured a room nearby. After wandering for a while, an older woman approached him and asked, "Young man, are you looking for a place to stay?" Chris nodded and confirmed, saying yes. The woman then said, "The places around here are likely all full, as many people have come to take exams. If there are any available, they might be in the city, or you might try looking in a nearby village. The village is only about 4 to 5 kilometers away, but I'm not sure if there will be any available rooms." Since it was already evening, Chris decided to follow the woman's advice and look for accommodations in the village, rather than heading to the city, which was quite far. He asked for directions to the village and eventually ended up taking a songthaw, a type of shared taxi, to the village. As the vehicle traveled further, it started to go down a dirt road, which felt very isolated. At that time, it was just Chris and a few other passengers. After passing a certain stretch of road, the other passengers gradually got off, leaving Chris alone. This made him wonder where the vehicle was taking him, as the surroundings were full of forests on both sides. Eventually, the songthaw arrived at a community area and stopped near what looked like an evening market. The driver shouted to Chris, "Young man, this is the last stop." Upon hearing this, Chris got off, paid the fare, and looked around. The area seemed to be a medium-sized rural village, with people coming out to do their market shopping. Chris quickly started exploring to find a place that offered daily rental rooms. After walking around for a while and asking at several places, he found that they only offered monthly rentals. Feeling discouraged and tired from traveling all day, Chris sat down to rest at a corner near the intersection by the market, looking like an unemployed person with an old black backpack. He couldn't think of what to do next. While Chris was resting, a man suddenly approached him and asked, "Are you looking for a place to stay? I heard from the lady who owns the rental rooms around here." Hearing this, Chris looked up and saw a chubby, curly-haired, dark-skinned man who seemed to be middle-aged, walking towards him holding the hand of a boy around 6 or 7 years old. Chris then replied to the man, "Yes, sir. Do you know of any daily rental places? Anywhere will do. I just need a place for one night. I have an exam tomorrow." The man responded, This area is out of town, so it's hard to find one. How about I take you to stay at my relative's place? It's just a regular house, not a dormitory." Hearing this felt like a blessing from heaven. Chris quickly agreed, and the man took him to his motorcycle and they drove off together. Chris sat on the back of the motorcycle with the man, while the young boy, who seemed to be his son, sat in front. The man seemed harmless. He drove Chris along a road that eventually led to a very isolated stretch. Chris had to shout and ask, "How much further is it, sir?" He was also worried about how he would get back in the morning, since he had an exam the next day. The man assured him not to worry, saying that his relative would drive him back to the market in the morning. After driving for a while, the man turned into a temple, drove through to the back where the surroundings were rice fields and there were farms along the way. There were only a few scattered houses. Chris started to wonder if it was too late to change his mind, thinking why it had to be this deep into the area. The motorcycle took Chris from the back of the temple to a stop in front of an old, single-story wooden house with a zinc roof and no fence. The man shouted a woman's name in front of the house. Then another man came out. The driver greeted him. "Hey, when did you get back from Bangkok?" They chatted for a bit, mostly catching up and asking about the other man's mother, who was away on errands. The driver then turned to Chris and said, "I saw him looking for a place to stay for his exam, so I brought him here for the night. Find him a room for one night." After more conversation, the homeowner asked Chris to follow him. Chris, a bit confused, followed the man around the house to the backyard, which led to a garden. They walked through the garden for about 100 meters and arrived at a small single-story wooden house, no bigger than 5 by 5 meters. The homeowner said, "Take a look inside and see if you can stay here. There's no electricity, so I'll bring you a lantern." Inside, Chris was a bit startled. It looked like a storage room. The floor was wooden planks, as were the walls, and the room was filled with old items against the walls, leaving only a small 3 by 2 meter space in the middle to sleep. The homeowner noticed Chris's reaction and asked if he could stay. Being from a rural area, Chris wasn't too picky. As long as there was a place to sleep, it was fine. So, he replied, "No problem, I can sleep here." The homeowner added, "If you need to shower, you can use the bathroom behind the house." Chris then asked about the rent, but the homeowner said, "No charge. This house isn't for rent. I haven't been home in years, just visiting after 4 years, and my mom isn't here. If she were, you'd stay in the main house, not this storage room." After some more chatting, the homeowner went to get a lighter and lantern. Chris began to explore the house. He noticed thick dust on the floor and various items piled against the walls, though it was too dark to see clearly. There were rolled mats stacked up, which he planned to use after cleaning the floor a bit. He found some cloth and went to fetch water to clean the floor where he would sleep. While cleaning, the homeowner brought him the lantern and lighter. After finishing mopping the floor, laying out the mats, and arranging the space, Chris hurried to take a shower before it got dark. When he came out of the bathroom, the surroundings were starting to get dark. He quickly lit the lantern, got dressed, and sat down to read a book in the middle of the room. Chris read for quite a while, and as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he began to notice more details inside the room. Looking at the wall near the door, he saw an old, large wooden cart leaning against it. To his left, he spotted a big, tall table with wooden planks stacked on top and various items piled around it, taking up more than half the room. When he looked behind him, he saw some wooden planks neatly arranged. The atmosphere at that moment was early evening. After reading for a while, Chris felt hungry, so he took out the instant noodles he had brought and ate them dry, crumbling them in the packet and eating them straight. The environment was extremely quiet, with only the sound of crickets chirping. Suddenly, there was the sound of creaking wooden planks breaking the silence, as if someone were walking on the wooden floor inside the house. The noise came from the area on the left where many items were piled up. Chris looked towards the source of the sound, but the lantern's light didn't reach that far, so he only saw darkness. He thought the wooden floor was creaking due to the cold weather. After finishing his instant noodles, Chris felt sleepy. He decided to lie down for a nap, planning to wake up and read more later. He used his clothes as a pillow. While relaxing and letting his mind wander, he turned on his side to the left. When he opened his eyes, he saw the legs of a tall table. Upon closer inspection, he noticed carvings on the table legs. When he looked up at the table again, Chris was startled and quickly sat up. The table was not an ordinary table. It was an old pulpit used by monks for sermons. At that moment, Chris wondered why such an item was stored there. He tried to reassure himself that it was just an old item kept in storage by the homeowner. Chris resumed reading his book, but after a while, he heard the sound of someone bathing. He listened closely and realized it sounded like someone continuously scooping water and pouring it over themselves without stopping. Curious and puzzled, Chris wondered who would be bathing so vigorously. He got up and shouted through the wall, "Who's bathing?" As soon as he spoke, the bathing sound stopped abruptly, and there was no response. Standing there with his heart racing, Chris heard the bathroom door creak open slowly. He shouted again, "Who's there? Can you hear me?" When there was still no answer, Chris took the lantern, opened the door, and walked around the house to peek around the corner. He wanted to see if anyone was coming out of the bathroom, but he saw no one. Deciding to investigate, Chris approached the bathroom and found the door slightly ajar. When he looked inside, the water in the basin was completely still, exactly as it had been when he left it earlier that evening. This discovery sent a chill down Chris's spine, and he quickly walked back to the house. Before entering, he glanced at the homeowner's house and saw that it was dark, indicating they had probably gone to bed. Chris hurried back inside, locked the door, and said his prayers before lying down to sleep, hoping for morning to come quickly. He had a habit from home of setting up a mosquito net before sleeping to keep insects and other pests out. Chris looked around the room to see if there was a mosquito net. Using the lantern, he explored a cabinet in the room and found it was used for storing bedding. However, the cabinet was placed against the left wall, which was cluttered with items. Chris had to move chairs and wooden scraps out of the way to reach the cabinet. Climbing over the stacked wooden planks and chairs, he finally reached the cabinet, but it wouldn't open because a wooden box was obstructing it. Chris placed the lantern on the floor and pushed the wooden box aside. Eventually, he managed to open the cabinet, and inside he found pillows, a mattress, and a mosquito net, just as he had hoped. Chris grabbed the pillow and mosquito net, closed the cabinet, and tried to climb back. Suddenly, the wooden planks he was standing on shifted, causing him to slip and fall hard on the floor, his head hitting something. He clutched his head in pain, lying there with his eyes closed. As the pain subsided, Chris slowly opened his eyes and noticed faint white letters in the dim light. Focusing more closely, he saw the words birth and death, along with dates. Alarmed, he quickly stood up and looked at the object in front of him. To his shock, The wooden box he had moved earlier was a coffin. Chris grabbed the lantern and hurried back to his sleeping area. He hastily set up the mosquito net and crawled inside, covering himself with a towel, lying with his back to the coffin, hoping to fall asleep quickly and make it through the night. Exhausted, Chris eventually fell asleep. He woke up feeling cold, his feet uncovered because the towel was too short. He noticed the lantern's light was still on, though it seemed dimmer. He wondered why it was so cold and checked his watch. It was only 2 a.m. He tried to go back to sleep, but suddenly heard strong winds outside, as if a storm was coming. When the wind quieted, there was a knock at the front door, startling Chris. He looked towards the door, puzzled about who would knock at such a late hour. He stayed silent, listening for the knock again. When it came, he shouted, "Who's there?" but received no reply. The wind picked up again, causing the lantern's light to flicker. The knocking resumed, louder and more insistent. Frightened, Chris yelled, "Who is it? What do you want?" But again, there was no response. Gathering his courage, Chris grabbed a pen as a makeshift weapon and decided to confront whoever was at the door. He opened the door to find nothing but emptiness and a strong gust of wind hitting his face. Seeing no one outside, Chris stood confused for a moment before shutting the door and rushing back to his mosquito net. He wrapped himself in his towel, covered his head, and tried to block out the noise and fall asleep. However, his ordeal was far from over. The knocking resumed, but this time it sounded like someone was shaking the door, trying to force their way inside. When the shaking ceased, Chris cautiously crept over to the wagon wheel, climbing it to peer through a crack in the wooden wall. He stared out for a long time, seeing nothing unusual. As he started to climb back down, the knocking echoed again. He quickly looked through the crack once more and noticed something that looked like a log positioned near the door. Trying to discern what it was, he saw that the log extended beyond his line of sight. As Chris examined it further, the knocking came again. He leaned in closer to find a clear view of the object at the door. What he saw shocked him to his core. It was a giant hand. The log he had seen was the forearm of this enormous appendage. Horrified, Chris recoiled, paralyzed with fear, just as the lantern's light began to flicker and die. Looking down, he noticed shadows gathering around the base of the dais where the pulpit was. Above the pulpit, he saw a shadowy figure resembling a monk seated there. But the most terrifying sight was the long-haired woman standing on the coffin, her head hanging with hair obscuring her face. Chris, panic-stricken, jumped down and desperately tried to open the door to escape. In his peripheral vision, he saw the woman shift from standing on the coffin to sitting on its edge. Once outside, Chris ran through the garden towards the owner's house, shouting incoherently, which caused the nearby dogs to start howling. He banged on the door of the house for a long time, but no one answered. Finally, he noticed the door was secured with chains and a padlock, indicating no one was home. He fled to the street, searching for any signs of light or life in the nearby houses, but found none. Chris continued running until he reached the back of the temple. Seeing the light on in a monk's dwelling, he ran towards it, shouting for help. A monk eventually opened the door and asked, "What happened to you? Why is there blood all over your head?" Chris touched his head and felt the wet, sticky blood, realizing it must have come from his earlier fall. He explained the events and described the house he had stayed in. The monk told him that the house belonged to an old undertaker who had passed away about 2 years ago. The monk then left briefly and returned, telling Chris that a temple boy would take him to the abbot's quarters on a motorbike to get his wound treated. After his wound was cared for, Chris was allowed to stay at the temple until morning. Around 6 a.m., with the sun fully risen, Chris asked the temple boy to take him back to the house to retrieve his belongings. When they arrived, Chris walked through the garden to the house where he had stayed the night before, finding the door still wide open. He quickly gathered his things, packing his bag, and went inside the mosquito net to grab his towel, which was stained with his blood, as were the pillow and the towel. After collecting everything, Chris hurried out, shut the door, and didn't look back. On the motorcycle ride away, the temple boy asked, "Did you really sleep there last night? How could you? That house has been abandoned for years." The harrowing events of the previous night nearly caused Chris to miss his exam. The experiences he endured left him with lingering questions about why the house owner directed him to stay there and what had transpired in that house. Despite the misfortune, there was a silver lining. Chris successfully passed his exam